The story of Ruth, a journey from loss to hope. Have you ever felt like an outsider, wondering if you truly belong somewhere? Or have you ever faced difficult circumstances, uncertain about what the future holds? If so, you are not alone. And the story we are about to explore might be exactly what you need to hear right now. Let's talk about Ruth, one of the most remarkable women in the Bible. Her story is not just an ancient account, it carries profound lessons about faith, loyalty, and love. Imagine a blockbuster movie filled with drama, tragedy, love, courage, and a surprising ending. That is the story of Ruth. At this time, Israel was going through a difficult period. Famine ravaged the land, people struggled to survive, and many seemed to have forgotten the presence of God. It was in this chaotic situation that we meet Ruth, a woman from Moab, about to embark on a journey that would change her life forever. You might wonder, why should I care about the story of a woman who lived thousands of years ago? But be patient, because what follows will show that God can turn even the hardest circumstances into something beautiful. This is not just a story of going from poverty to prosperity, from being an outsider to being accepted, but also a journey from despair to a legacy that changed history. Are you ready to discover how a foreign, widowed woman became one of the most significant figures in the lineage of Jesus Christ? Let's explore this inspiring story and see what it can teach us about faith, love, and perseverance. The story begins in the land of Moab, a place with a complicated history with Israel. The Moabites were descendants of Lot, and for generations, they had conflicts with the Israelites. Ruth was born into a culture that worshipped many gods, completely different from the faith of the Israelites. The Bible does not detail her childhood, but perhaps Ruth had been curious about the beliefs of the Israelites living around her, even though she remained deeply connected to her own traditions. In this setting, a family from Bethlehem appears, a man named Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Due to the severe famine, they were forced to leave their homeland and move to Moab in search of a better life. We can only imagine how they felt, leaving their home behind and stepping into a foreign land with a different culture. They did not go to Moab for glory or wealth, but for a very human reason, survival. In Moab, Mahlon married Ruth, while Chilion married another Moabite woman named Orpah. Marriages between Israelites and Moabites were uncommon at that time, and the young couples likely faced many cultural and religious differences. We do not know exactly how long they lived together, but it was enough time for Ruth to be exposed to the faith of the Israelites. This would have a significant impact on the decisions she would make later on. Not long after, Elimelech, the pillar of the family, passed away. Naomi became a widow in a foreign land. For a woman at that time, losing her husband meant losing her primary protection and support in society. But the tragedy did not stop there. Within a short time, both of her sons also died. Now, not only Naomi, but also Ruth and Orpah, became young widows. Can you imagine their pain and despair? 3 women, losing everything, no one to rely on, no possessions, and no certainty about the future. For Naomi, it was even more heartbreaking. She had not only lost her husband and sons but also the hope of continuing her family's lineage. In the social context of that time, women had very few rights. Without a man in the family, they were vulnerable to instability and often abandoned by society. And for Naomi, being far from her homeland made her situation even more difficult. Now, they faced a choice: stay in Moab or return to Bethlehem. This decision would shape the destiny of each of them. Naomi, heavy with grief, decided to return to her homeland in Israel. She had heard that the famine had ended, and now, all she wanted was to return to where she belonged. But what about Ruth and Orpah? Should they go with her? This was the most crucial moment in Ruth's life. She could take the easier path, stay in her homeland, remarry, and continue her life in the culture she was familiar with. But instead, she made a bold decision, one that would change everything. At that time, a woman without a husband or son faced extreme hardship. With no one to protect or provide for her, she was vulnerable to the injustices and harsh realities of life. That was exactly the situation for Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. Naomi, burdened with the sorrow of losing her husband and sons, was now left with only her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. She likely regretted leaving Bethlehem years ago, and now, there was nothing keeping her in Moab. Believing that God had shown mercy to his people and ended the famine, Naomi decided to return home. But she did not want her daughters-in-law to endure the same loneliness she would face in a foreign land. With sincere love, Naomi urged Ruth and Orpah to return to their mothers' homes, where they could remarry and start over. She prayed that God would bless them because they had been kind to her and their late husbands. This was not just a simple suggestion, it was a great act of sacrifice. Naomi loved her daughters-in-law so much that she was willing to let them go, even though it meant she would face old age alone. Naomi's words moved both Ruth and Orpah to tears. They were not just mother-in-law and daughters-in-law, they were women who had shared deep loss and sorrow together. In the end, Orpah, though heartbroken, chose to return to her mother's house. This was not a wrong choice, it was simply the more practical path for her. But Ruth was different. When Naomi continued to urge Ruth to go back, she responded with words of unwavering devotion, words that have echoed through history. "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." Ruth 1 verses 16 to 17. This declaration was not just a promise of loyalty to Naomi, it was also a statement of faith. Ruth was not only choosing to follow Naomi, she was choosing to follow the God of Israel. A Moabite woman, raised in a completely different culture, worshipping foreign gods, was willing to leave everything behind to follow an aging woman and a God she had only just begun to know. This was a decision full of risks. As a foreigner in Israel, Ruth might face discrimination. She had no family there, no possessions, and no guarantees for her future. Yet, despite all this, she chose to follow Naomi and trust in God. Ruth's loyalty was proof of a strong faith and an unconditional love. And this very decision laid the foundation for the miracles that were about to unfold in her life. Naomi did not argue any further. She understood that Ruth was determined, and so the two of them set out on the journey back to Bethlehem. This was not just a geographical journey but also a spiritual journey of transformation. The distance from Moab to Bethlehem was about 80 kilometers, crossing desolate lands and rough terrain. Two women, one elderly, the other young but a stranger to the new land, walked together, carrying both their sorrows and their hopes. We can imagine their conversations along the way. Naomi might have told Ruth about her homeland, about the laws and traditions of Israel, and about how God had delivered his people in the past. Meanwhile, Ruth might have asked questions about the God she was now placing her trust in and about the new life she was about to begin. There must have been times when they felt exhausted and anxious. Two women walking a long distance, unprotected, uncertain of what awaited them. Yet, every step they took was a step of faith, a faith placed in God, who always works in miraculous ways. As they drew closer to Bethlehem, the landscape gradually changed. The barren lands of Moab faded into the distance, replaced by the lush hills of Judah. Ruth was stepping into a completely new world, one where she did not know if she would be welcomed or rejected. After days of hardship, Naomi and Ruth finally arrived in Bethlehem. For Naomi, this return was filled with pain. She had left with a complete family but was now coming back empty-handed, no husband, no sons. But for Ruth, this was a beginning, a new life in a foreign land, where she would have to find a way to belong and survive. They had no idea that, in just a short time, their lives would be completely transformed. God was about to use Ruth, a foreign woman, to fulfill a great plan, one far beyond anything they could have imagined. But for now, these two women had only one thing that truly mattered: they had each other, and they had faith in God. When Naomi and Ruth set foot in Bethlehem, their arrival quickly caught the attention of the townspeople. The whole town was stirred, and people whispered among themselves, "Is this Naomi?" Ruth 1 verse 19. These words were not just expressions of surprise but also carried a sense of sympathy. Naomi, who had once left with a complete family, was now returning empty-handed, no husband, no sons, accompanied only by her foreign daughter-in-law. Facing the scrutinizing gazes, Naomi could not hide her pain. She responded bitterly, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Ruth 1 verse 20. In Hebrew, Naomi means pleasant or sweet, while Mara means bitter. Her response reflected her state of mind, once full, now returning in loss and emptiness. Yet, even in her suffering, Naomi did not deny God's sovereignty. She referred to him as the Almighty, acknowledging that, despite her hardships, God was still in control of everything. For Ruth, this moment was likely both uncomfortable and frightening. She was a foreigner standing in the midst of a new community, uncertain if she would be accepted. But one thing she knew for sure: she was not alone. She remained by Naomi's side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, a seemingly small detail but one that would become a crucial turning point in their story. This was the season that God had ordained to begin a new chapter in their lives. A new reality and Ruth's determination. Even though they had reached their new home, Ruth and Naomi still faced a harsh reality: they had to find a way to survive. As a widow in Israelite society, Naomi had no income, and Ruth, a foreigner, had neither wealth nor work. But instead of complaining, Ruth took initiative. She made a proposal to Naomi. "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Ruth 2 verse 2. In Israel, the law of Moses allowed the poor and foreigners to glean the leftover grain after the harvesters had gathered the crops. This was God's way of providing for those in need. So Ruth set out to work diligently in the fields, unaware that God had already prepared something extraordinary for her. She entered the field belonging to Boaz, a wealthy and influential man who was also a relative of Naomi's late husband. When Boaz visited his field and greeted the harvesters, he quickly noticed Ruth. "Who is that young woman?" he asked the overseer. The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi. She asked if she could gather grain, and since this morning, she has been working tirelessly, only taking a short rest in the shelter." Ruth 2 verses 6 to 7. Boaz was deeply moved by Ruth's story. He did not just see her as a foreigner but recognized her faith, loyalty, and diligence. Boaz approached Ruth and said, "Stay in my field, do not go to another. Follow my female workers. Whenever you are thirsty, drink from the water jars that my men have filled." Ruth 2 verses 8 to 9. This was extraordinary. Boaz not only allowed Ruth to glean in his fields but also ensured her safety, making sure no one would harm her. Overwhelmed, Ruth knelt and asked, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Ruth 2 verse 10. Boaz replied, "I have heard all that you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death. May the Lord reward you for your kindness. May you find refuge under the wings of the God of Israel." Ruth 2 verses 11 to 12. Boaz did not focus on Ruth's background, instead, he saw her heart. He understood that she was not just a Moabite woman but someone with faith, courage, and selflessness. Boaz's kindness continues. Boaz did not stop at words. He invited Ruth to eat lunch with his harvesters and personally handed her food. He even instructed his workers to deliberately leave extra grain for Ruth, allowing her to gather more than usual. That day, Ruth not only had enough to eat but also collected about an ephah of barley, nearly 14 kilograms, 30 pounds. This was an unusually large amount for a gleaner, clearly showing that Boaz had special regard for her. When Ruth returned home with her harvest, Naomi was astonished. She immediately asked, "Where did you work today? Who showed you such kindness?" Ruth recounted everything, mentioning Boaz's generosity. The moment Naomi heard his name, her face lit up with joy. "My daughter, Boaz is one of our family's kinsman redeemers. The Lord has not forgotten his kindness to the living and the dead." Ruth 2 verse 20. From despair, Naomi now began to see hope. Their future no longer seemed uncertain, for they had found someone who could provide and protect them. A plan for Ruth's future. But Naomi knew that this was only the beginning. A plan was forming in her mind, a plan that could change Ruth's destiny completely. When Ruth returned home after a long day of hard work, she not only brought back an abundant harvest but also a piece of good news. She had met Boaz, a wealthy and kind man who happened to be a relative of Naomi. Naomi immediately realized that this was no mere coincidence, this was God's divine providence. She told Ruth, "Boaz is one of our kinsman redeemers." Ruth 2 verse 20. The term kinsman redeemer carried great significance in Israelite culture. According to the law at the time, if a man died without a son, his closest relative had the responsibility to marry the widow to ensure that the family's lineage and inheritance remained intact. Seeing this opportunity, Naomi began to devise a plan, not just to provide Ruth with food but to secure her a stable and happy future. Naomi did not want Ruth to simply get by, she wanted her future to be secure. This was Naomi's way of repaying Ruth's loyalty and devotion. Naomi said to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not find a home for you, where you will be well provided for?" Ruth 3 verse 1. Naomi was not only concerned about Ruth's well-being but genuinely cared about her future. And she had a bold plan, one that might seem unusual by today's standards but was entirely in line with the customs of that time. She instructed Ruth, "Wash, put on perfume, and dress in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but do not let Boaz know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." Ruth 3 verses 3 to 4. At first glance, this seemed like a risky move. A woman sneaking into a man's sleeping area. Could this be misunderstood? But in reality, this act had deep symbolic meaning. In Israel, uncovering someone's feet was not a suggestive action but a gesture of submission and a plea for protection. Ruth was not merely expressing her interest in Boaz, she was asking him to fulfill his duty as a kinsman redeemer and take her as his wife according to the law. Still, this was a bold and risky step. Ruth was a foreigner, and Boaz was a man of status. If he rejected her, she would face humiliation, and her reputation, as well as Naomi's, could be at stake. But Ruth did not hesitate. She responded to Naomi with unwavering determination. "I will do whatever you say." Ruth 3 verse 5. Ruth had once committed to following Naomi and her God. Now, once again, she placed her full trust in the woman who had loved her like a daughter. A life-changing moment. As night fell, Ruth quietly made her way to the threshing floor, where Boaz was resting after a long day of work. No one knew that this night would change her life forever. When Boaz had fallen into a deep sleep, Ruth approached, gently uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, Boaz suddenly woke up. Sensing someone nearby, he was startled. In the darkness, he asked, "Who are you?" Softly, Ruth answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread the corner of your garment over me, for you are my kinsman redeemer." Ruth 3 verse 9. The phrase, "spread the corner of your garment," carried profound significance. It was not merely an act of protection, it was a subtle yet direct way of saying, "Please marry me and redeem my family." Boaz, though surprised, was neither angry nor offended. He saw in Ruth not just a widow in need of help but a woman of noble character, loyalty, and virtue. He said to Ruth, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than what you showed before, because you have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. Do not be afraid, I will do for you all that you ask. All the people of this town know that you are a woman of noble character." Ruth 3 verses 10 to 11. Boaz was deeply moved, not by Ruth's outward appearance, but by her heart. A complication in the redemption process. However, things could not be resolved immediately. Boaz explained that there was a closer relative who, by law, had the first right to redeem Ruth. But he assured her that if this man refused, he himself would fulfill that duty. Ruth remained there until early morning but left quietly before dawn to protect both her and Boaz's reputation. Before she departed, Boaz gave her a generous amount of barley, a sign to Naomi that he was serious about his intentions. When Ruth returned home and shared everything, Naomi smiled, recognizing that God was at work. "Wait, my daughter, until you see how this matter turns out. For the man will not rest until this is settled today." Ruth 3 verse 18. At that moment, none of them knew exactly what the future held. But one thing was certain, God was orchestrating everything. The final decision, who will redeem Ruth? Ruth had acted with faith and loyalty. Boaz had responded with kindness and honor. Now, they simply had to wait and see how God would complete his plan. A confrontation was about to take place. Would Boaz be able to officially become Ruth's redeemer, or would she belong to someone else? Ruth walked through the darkness, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and determination. Before her, the scene was peaceful, the harvest had ended, and Boaz and his workers were celebrating the season's bounty. As Naomi instructed, Ruth patiently waited. When the feast was over, Boaz, content and satisfied, lay down at the end of the grain pile to sleep. This was Ruth's moment to act. She quietly approached, uncovered his feet, and lay down. This was not just a bold act but a deeply symbolic gesture in Israelite culture. Ruth was humbly proposing marriage, asking Boaz to redeem and protect her. In the middle of the night, Boaz suddenly woke up. Startled to find someone at his feet, he asked, "Who are you?" Ruth's voice, though soft, was filled with determination. "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread the corner of your garment over me, for you are my kinsman redeemer." Ruth 3 verse 9. The act of spreading the garment symbolized protection and provision, a request for Boaz to take on the role of kinsman redeemer according to Israelite law. By saying this, Ruth was expressing her willingness to become his wife, not only to secure her own future but also to preserve Naomi's family lineage. However, there was a challenge. Boaz was a close relative, but not the closest. According to the law, another relative had the first right to redeem Naomi's family. As an honorable man, Boaz knew he could not assume this role unless he followed proper legal procedures. He promised Ruth, "There is a kinsman redeemer closer than I. If he is willing to redeem you, let him do so. But if he is not willing, I will redeem you, as surely as the Lord lives. Stay here until morning." Ruth 3 verses 12 to 13. Although Boaz clearly cared for Ruth, he wanted everything to be done with integrity and respect. This further proved his character and worthiness of Ruth's trust. Before dawn, Boaz gave Ruth 6 measures of barley, saying, "Do not go back to Naomi empty-handed." This was more than a generous gift, it was a silent promise that he would do all he could to redeem her. Ruth hurried home, her heart filled with both anxiety and hope. When she told Naomi everything, Naomi smiled knowingly and reassured her. "Wait, my daughter, until you see how this matter turns out. For the man will not rest until he settles this today." Ruth 3 verse 18. Naomi understood that Boaz was a man of action. He would not delay in resolving this matter. As Naomi predicted, the very next morning, Boaz went straight to the town gate, the place where important legal matters were discussed. He sat down and waited for the closer kinsman redeemer to arrive. When the man appeared, Boaz called him over and gathered 10 elders of the town as witnesses. This was a public and legally binding process in Israelite society. Boaz explained, "Naomi, who has returned from Moab, is selling the land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. As the closest relative, you have the first right to redeem it. If you want to do so, redeem it, but if not, let me know, for I am next in line." Ruth 4 verses 3 to 4. The relative immediately responded, "I will redeem it." But Boaz had not yet finished. He added, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you must also marry Ruth, the Moabite widow, to maintain the deceased man's family line." Ruth 4 verse 5. At this, the man hesitated. "I cannot do it, or it might endanger my own estate." "You redeem it yourself, I cannot do it." Ruth 4 verse 6. According to tradition, to finalize the transaction, the man removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz as a symbolic act of transferring his right. Boaz then turned to the elders and all the people present, proclaiming, "Today, you are witnesses that I have redeemed all that belonged to Elimelech, and I have taken Ruth as my wife to preserve the name of the deceased. May the Lord bless us." Ruth 4 verses 9 to 10. The townspeople responded with blessings for Boaz and Ruth, comparing her to the great women of Israel's history. Boaz and Ruth were officially married. Their union was not just a beautiful love story, it was a restoration of honor and future security for Naomi's family. Soon after, Ruth gave birth to a son, Obed. Naomi, who had once returned to Bethlehem in bitterness, now held her grandson in her arms. The women of the town rejoiced with her, saying, "Praise the Lord! He has not forgotten you. This child will bring you joy and continue your family's name." Ruth 4 verses 14 to 15. Obed later became the grandfather of King David, and from this lineage came Jesus Christ, the Messiah. The story of Ruth is more than just a beautiful romance, it is a testament to God's providence. From a poor foreign widow, Ruth became an essential part of God's redemptive plan. Her life teaches us that faithfulness, integrity, and trust in God can lead to unimaginable blessings, not just for ourselves but for generations to come.